All right, here we go with the last section of chapter one and of period one of our AP U.S. history units. So here's the focus question, and we'll go from there. Even as other European powers disdained Spain's treatment of the Indians, they aspired to match the Spanish Empire's incredible mineral wealth. With the balance of economic power altered by Spain's success, rival French, Dutch, and English colonists established colonies in North America during the 17th century. The French, who were first, hoped to find gold and locate a northwest passage to the Pacific. Failed initial settlements were followed by permanent settlements in the Mississippi River Valley and along the St. Lawrence River in what became Canada, and what was then called New France. But fears that France's large population, its main advantage against England, would be depleted by colonial settlement kept emigration low. Furthermore, negative reports of the conditions and opportunities in North America dissuaded many people from making the journey. The viability of New France, with its small white population and emphasis on the fur trade rather than agricultural settlement, depended on friendly relations with native nations. The French prided themselves on adopting a more humane policy than their imperial rivals. Lacking the need for Indian labor of the Spanish and the voracious appetite for land of the English colonies, and relying on Indians to supply furs to trading posts, the French and their native allies worked out a complex series of military, commercial, and diplomatic connections, the most enduring alliances between Indians and Europeans in colonial North America. The Jesuits, a missionary religious order, did seek, with some success, to convert Indians to Catholicism. Unlike Spanish missionaries in early New Mexico, they allowed Christian Indians to retain a high degree of independence and much of their traditional social structure, and they did not seek to suppress all traditional religious practices. Indians who converted to Catholicism were promised full membership in French colonial society. In fact, however, it was far from rarer for natives to adopt French ways than for French settlers to become attracted to the free life of the Indians. Native Americans required French traders to follow their rules. The first French trading partners among the St. Lawrence River were Inuits, or Montagnais, Algonquins, and Wendots, or Hurons, who recruited French trade and demanded good prices for furs. Algonquins were a nation within the large linguistic grouping known as Algonquin. When the French established Quebec, it was on Algonquin land, and because Algonquin leaders invited them. These allies of the French also insisted that the French join their military alliance against their enemy, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois League, discussed previously. Thus, Inis, Algonquins, and Wendots drew the French into a major war that they did not want. Native Americans incorporated European goods into their existing ways of life, using copper kettles as well as ceramic pots, adding wool blankets to animal skins and furs, and using guns for some tasks and bows and arrows, sometimes tipped with brass, for others. Some native women married the single Frenchmen who came to New France and incorporated them and their children into native communities. The Dutch first came to the New World in 1609 with Henry Hudson's exploration of the New York harbor and the river that would come to bear his name, setting the stage for the establishment in 1624 of New Amsterdam, the Dutch outpost on Manhattan that became the basis for New York. Although small in size and population, the Netherlands was the center of a global maritime empire of trade, culture, and enlightenment, and the Dutch invented practices such as the joint stock company that were critical to the birth of modern capitalism. The Dutch prided themselves on their devotion to liberty. In Europe, no other country aside from the Netherlands had established freedom of the press or the right to private religious practice. The Dutch Reformed Church was the official national church, but individuals were free to choose their religious preference. That freedom led people from all over Europe to seek religious and economic refuge among the Dutch, and many of those people would eventually settle in the Dutch colonies. Though the Netherlands was exceptional in its commitment to freedom of the press and religious toleration, New Netherland was hardly governed democratically. New Amsterdam was ruled by the West India Company and lacked an elected assembly or a town council, both of which were common in the Netherlands at the time. But enslaved people in the Dutch colonies had some rights. They were given land to support their families, but had to pay an annual fee to the company and work for the company when called on. Enslaved people in New Netherland worked on family farms or in craft labor rather than in a plantation system such as that in the West Indies. Women also experienced more freedom than in other colonies. Dutch law allowed them to retain separate legal identities from their husbands, borrow money, and own property, and widows and daughters could expect to be included in wills alongside sons. New Netherland attracted a diverse array of settlers from different areas of the world, and of course that included the practice of a variety of religions. The Dutch were more tolerant of other religions than other colonial communities in other areas of the Americas, but it's important to note that the official religion of both Holland and New Netherland was the Dutch Reformed Church. Thus, while more tolerant of religious diversity, New Netherland was not completely devoid of conflict over religion. Restrictions on openly practicing other religions besides that of the Dutch Reformed Church were denied by government officials, and in some instances, those who protested the restrictions were arrested for defiance. The freedom was of religious practice in private, but not public. Officials and colonists were expected to defend the Dutch Reformed faith in New Netherland. Nonetheless, religious freedom was more extensive than in other empires. On European maps, New France and New Netherland were large land claims, but in reality they were a few trading posts and small settlements surrounded by native nations. The Dutch came to North America to trade, and they prided themselves on getting along well with native peoples. Mindful of the black legend of Spanish cruelty, the Dutch determined to treat the native inhabitants more humanely. Having won their own independence from Spain after the longest and bloodiest war of 16th century Europe, many Dutch identified with American Indians as fellow victims of Spanish oppression. From the beginning, Dutch authorities recognized native sovereignty over the land and forbade settlement in any area unless it had been purchased. By the 1640s, Dutch traders were exporting tens of thousands of furs each year. Most of them traded from the Mohawks, one of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee League. The Mohawks dominated trade at Fort Orange, which was later Albany. They used their market power in furs to set prices. The Dutch repeatedly outlawed the sale of white bread and cake, as well as liquor and guns to Indians, but native customers always got around the restrictions. Mohawks seized canoes descending the St. Lawrence River to the French posts of Montreal and Quebec. In the early decades of the 1600s, the Haudenosaunee expanded their domain far beyond their homelands, driving off or forcibly incorporating native nations from the St. Lawrence River to the Carolinas, and from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. Although European maps labeled vast regions as New France, New Netherland, and New England, everyone knew that the Haudenosaunee were the most powerful people in the Northeast. The Dutch West India Company decided that a settlement at the mouth of the Hudson River would protect Dutch trade from French and English pirates and produce grain and cattle for Fort Orange and the sugar plantations that the Dutch were establishing on Caribbean islands and the coast of South America. They gained permission to establish New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island through negotiations with Delaware or Lenape diplomats. In an attempt to attract settlers to North America, the Dutch West India Company promised colonists not only the right to practice their religion freely in private, but also cheap livestock and free land after 6 years of labor. Eventually, it surrendered its monopoly of the fur trade, opening this profitable commerce to all. In 1629, the company adopted a plan of freedoms and exemptions, offering large estates to patroons, shareholders who agreed to transport tenants for agricultural labor, and purchase the land from Indians in a treaty approved by both sides. In return, the patroon was to have freedoms like those of a medieval lord, including the right to 10% of his tenants' annual income and complete authority over law enforcement within his domain. Mohicans granted land for both Fort Orange and a patroonship for Kilian van Rensselaer in return for benefits and payments, but no other patroonship succeeded. The Dutch desire to attract colonists put New Amsterdam and its surrounding farms in conflict with Delawares, the Lenapes and the Munsees. The Dutch took more land than the Delawares had agreed to, and Dutch pigs and cattle damaged Delaware women's crops. Delawares, in turn, killed and ate the invasive livestock. New Netherland Governor William Kieft in 1639 demanded that Delaware started paying yearly tribute in corn. A 3-year war followed that resulted in the death of an estimated 1,000 Delawares and their allies and more than 200 colonists. Many Dutch settlers fled the colony, and the war dissuaded new settlers. Over the course of the 17th century, the Netherlands sent 1 million people overseas, many of them recent immigrants who were not in fact Dutch, to populate and govern their far-flung colonies. Very few, however, made North America their destination. By the mid-1660s, the European population of New Netherland numbered only 9,000. New Netherland remained a tiny backwater in the Dutch Empire. A borderland, according to one historian, is a meeting place of peoples where geographical and cultural borders are not clearly defined. Many of these areas developed during European settlement, such as the Great Lakes region in New France. Overlapping claims to authority and hybrid cultures developed there. Europeans generally consolidated their power at the expense of American Indian power, but at the edges of empire, power and culture dynamics were unstable. European claims often competed against one another, and American Indians often skillfully played these groups against each other, thus increasing their own power at certain points. The types of settlements were therefore different depending on which colonizing power established them. All colonizers brought some form of Christianity, new technology, legal and family relations, new types of warfare, and new diseases. Dreams of freedom for Europeans and Indians alike through the spread of Christianity were continually cited as the justification for conquest and colonization. England entered the fold at the outset of the 17th century under the same pretenses. So here's a map which was produced in France, depicting the French ambition to dominate North America. So that's the end of Chapter 1, Section 6, and Chapter 1. So we'll see you next time.